Good afternoon, everybody. I am recording this on Veterans Day. Veterans Day, talking about the Civil War, how appropriate. And there is a worksheet that I have downloaded on Google Classroom called Civil War Notes Worksheet. And I hope that you're able to access that as I go through this PowerPoint presentation on some basic things that I think you need to know about the Civil War, which went on from 1861 to 1865. It was exactly a 4-year war, April of 1861 to April of 1865. So let's start with this by just saying that the Civil War is still very much interesting to a lot of Americans. It is by far the most popular event in American history. It's the most researched about, and this man who I've talked about already this year, Ken Burns, who's made a number of American history documentary series, and he really became well known for the first time in 1990 when he came out with his series on the Civil War. And here is the cover of that DVD series that he came out with. It is the most watched American history documentary to date in American television history. In fact, the week that it came out in September of 1990 on all the public broadcasting service stations, there was estimated around 39 million Americans at least watched one episode or more of that series. And there was about 7 episodes in the series. One of the historians that he really interviewed and quoted a lot in that series was a man by the name of Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote, up until he died in 2005, probably was the best informed historian on the Civil War. He wrote a big 3-volume trilogy on it. And how important is the Civil War in American history? I'm gonna share a quote with you about the Civil War that he made on the Ken Burns series. And here's that quote. Any understanding of this nation has to be based, and I mean really based, on an understanding of the Civil War. I believe that firmly. It defined us. The Revolution did what it did. Our involvement in European wars, beginning with the First World War, did what it did. But the Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. And it is very necessary if you're going to understand the American character in the 20th century to learn about this enormous catastrophe of the mid-19th century. It was the crossroads of our being, and it was a hell of a crossroads. And that unquote, again, quote by Shelby Foote in the Ken Burns series on the Civil War. So let's talk about we've already talked about in class a series of compromises that the government came up with in the mid 1800s, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which in my estimation merely postponed the Civil War. But sometimes books have a tremendous influence on events. And one of those examples was a book that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a writer who lived in Massachusetts. She was actually a real abolitionist. That's what people were called who were anti-slave people and that really felt that slavery should be done away with. She was an abolitionist, and she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold 1 million copies within the first couple of years of its publication in 1852. It is reported that the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, read that, and at the end, some of her aides said that when she put the book down, there were tears in her eyes. She wept. And of course, the Southerners said that Mrs. Stowe greatly exaggerated the conditions of slave life in the South. That's exactly what the book was about, was a man by the name of Uncle Tom who was a slave. And obviously, this book did much to intensify the abolitionist feeling in the North and created animosity, more animosity towards Northerners in the South. So that's the first question on the Civil War Notes worksheet. Who was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and how did her book affect America in the 1850s? One of the things that also happened, this is where Abraham Lincoln became nationally well known. He was running for a Senate seat against the incumbent, a guy by the name of Douglas, Stephen Douglas, and they entered into a series of debates in Illinois, running for that Illinois Senate seat in 1858. There were 7 debates, and the thing that I want you to know about the debates is the main issue in those debates was whether or not to let the people in the new territories and new states decide whether they wanted slavery or not. Stephen Douglas actually wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He was in favor of popular sovereignty. He thought it would avoid a major conflict, where Lincoln was totally against the expansion of slavery. And so that's the answer to number 2. What was the main issue in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois in 1858? The answer is whether or not slavery should be expanded in the new states and new territories. Lincoln was against that. Douglas was in favor of it. In fact, both of these men would run for president in 1860, Douglas on the Democratic side, and of course, Lincoln on the Republican side. And then we've talked a little bit about John Brown already in class. Number 3, explain what were the effects of John Brown on the country in the 1850s. We know that John Brown was active in Kansas during the 1850s. He was a tall white man who thought he was called by God to end slavery in the United States. And he and his sons started killing people in Kansas who were pro-slavery people. And then he came up with the idea of trying to lead a slave revolt in 1859 when he took over the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And he was not successful in that. In fact, 2 of his sons were killed as federal troops tried to take back that federal arsenal. John Brown was apprehended and was convicted of treason and was hung in October of 1859. I really feel that this event, the John Brown affair in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, put the nation on the road to war. I don't think there was any turning back on that after this event. For the first time after John Brown was hung in Virginia, we begin to see the southern states organize militias, which was the start of the Southern Army. So you have the John Brown revolt, which I just referred to, and then as we have just had a pretty somewhat controversial election here in the year 2020, I have always felt that the most important election, no doubt about it, there was not a close second. The most important election in United States history was the election of 1860, because it was the last straw as far as the South was concerned with the election of Lincoln. The South began to think that they had lost all their voice in government, and so they felt like they needed to declare independence and form their own country. And that was really the major effect with the election of Lincoln in 1860. You can see here that there were actually 4 people running in that election. You had Lincoln against Douglas in the North. The Democratic Party really split. In fact, there was a Northern Democratic Party convention held in the North and a Southern Democratic convention held in the South. The Southern Democrat was a longtime congressman by the name of Breckinridge. And then there was actually another third party established called the Constitutional Union Party. And so there were actually 4 people running in this election. And Lincoln won. He won the Electoral College vote. In fact, in 9 of the southern states, he did not receive a vote. And in 7 of those 9 states, one of the main reasons he didn't receive a vote is they didn't even bother to put him on the presidential election ballot. And so Lincoln won. And of course, this election just verified how divided the United States was going into the Civil War. Here's a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln. One of the reasons I wanted you to see her, she was from Kentucky. Her dad had owned slaves. She also had 2 brothers that fought in the Confederate Army. So obviously the Lincoln family was divided like the country was. And then here is a map showing the states that were in the North, which are in purple there. You have the states in green that were in the South, and then of course the territories that were out west. And so that is how the country was divided going into the war at the end of 1860 and the beginning of 1861. Again, I put this map up because I wanted to show you that you'll notice right here that there is no West Virginia. West Virginia, the people in West Virginia basically wanted to leave Virginia because they didn't agree with slavery. And so West Virginia was not created as a state until right in the middle of the Civil War in 1863. And then you can see the other states there that are in yellow: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And those are the so-called border states, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Here are the main causes of the Civil War, and that's one of the questions on the worksheet. What were the 5 main causes of the war? Obviously, slavery is number 1, but also with the election of Lincoln, the South, as I alluded to earlier, felt that they no longer had any say in government. And they did not feel that the federal government had any right to tell them what to do regarding slavery or anything else. Also, the other thing was that the North and South were very different economically. And the North was undergoing an industrial age. More and more factories were being put together. And the North began to really rely on industry economically, where the South was staying basically an agricultural economy. And then, of course, we've talked about how important westward expansion was in bringing on the war, and then Lincoln being elected president. So those are the 5 main causes of the Civil War. This is an interesting graphic here, this pyramid. What's amazing to me is how few Southern men were actually slave owners. Of all of the people in the South, only 8% of the males were slave owners that owned 5 or more slaves. You had another 8% that owned anywhere from 1 to 4 slaves. Can you believe that of the male population, 50% of them were white and did not own slaves? And the main reason was they couldn't afford them. And so there was a wide disparity in the South between people who were really wealthy and people who were really poor. You can see there were at times, every now and then, not very often, there were a few Southern slave owners that did free a few of their slaves, but boy, that was very minimal. And then 32% of the male population in the South were black slaves. So anyway, I also wanted to bring up the next slide here. Jefferson Davis, longtime senator from Mississippi, he became the president of the Confederate States of America. When the southern states formed their own country, that's what they officially named themselves as, the Confederate States. A confederation is where you have a group of regions or states that come together and make some agreement. You remember earlier in the year we talked about the Articles of Confederation being the United States' first constitution, and there's that word confederation, and of course the root word of confederation is confederate. Here is the way the country was divided. Again, another map. And now I want to talk about the border states. The border states, as I referred to earlier, they're in dark green there. Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. As I said earlier, West Virginia did not become a state until 1863. Those were the states where slavery was legal, but they did not leave the Union. And Lincoln did everything he could to try to make sure that those states did not leave the Union. So there's two reasons why they're called border states. Obviously, they're right on the border between the North and the South. And then the second reason they're called border states is that they were slave states, but that never left the Union. By the way, on the Confederate flag, there are 13 stars, but there were only 11 states that left the Union. And the reason they went ahead and put 13 stars on there is the Southerners thought for sure that Kentucky and Missouri would join them, and Kentucky and Missouri never did. What are the strengths of the North and the South? Boy, the South didn't have a whole lot of strengths. You can see the total population of the North. There was about 31 million people in the United States in 1860. 71% of those people lived in the North, 29% of those people lived in the South. In fact, of the 31 million, 9 million people lived in the South, and 4 million of those 9 million were slaves. And so obviously, the North had a population advantage. Also, factory production, as I referred to earlier, the North was turning into an industrial economy. 91% of all factory goods being made in the United States were made in the North. Railroad mileage. Again, you can see the railroad mileage differences are the same as the population differences. 71% of the railroad track that had been built by 1860 was in the North, and only 29% in the South. Now, you might be surprised at this about the farmland, because obviously the South is more conducive to raising crops throughout the year than the North. But you have to understand that the South was mainly in the business of growing tobacco and cotton, two things that are not real edible. And where most of the edible crops were being raised were in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana. That's where the fruits and the vegetables during the summertime were being raised. So that's why it shows there on the pie chart that 75% of the edible foods were being raised in the North and only 25% in the South. And then, of course, the cotton production, the vast majority of cotton production obviously being raised in the South. So those are the strengths of the North. I think that question number 12 on the worksheet says, what were the strengths of the North going into the war? Include at least 3 strengths in your answer. So there you have it. This war saw a lot of firsts. Not only first in U.S. history, but first in world history. It's really sometimes been described as the war that was the first modern war. Repeating rifles really began to be used in this war. Machine guns, originally called the Gatling gun, The first machine gun was invented by a guy by the name of George Gatling. First time that ironclad ships did battle with each other, which basically made all wooden naval ships obsolete. Long-range artillery, we're talking about being able to accurately shoot cannonballs more than a mile in distance. And then the use of telescopic sights on guns, and then the first time in world history land and naval mines were used. So you have a question on the worksheet dealing with the types of weapons and name at least 6 of them in your answer. Let's move on. Weapons were far ahead in advancement than were military tactics. And that's the reason there were so many casualties in so many battles during the Civil War. In this day and age, if we had a over 30% casualty rate, people would be shocked and alarmed and probably demand an end to the fighting. There were many, many battles in the Civil War in which the casualty rate was all the way up in the mid 30% range, like 34, 35%. And the reason is that the military tactics, the military strategists just had not caught up with the advancement in military weaponry. And then we've already talked about the North and how they had the ability to really manufacture a lot of supplies. And that was a real advantage that the North had in the war. And as the men were off fighting, the women had to stay home and tend to the farming business. Again, still the vast majority of people in the country overall were engaged in agriculture. And so women gained new opportunities in running businesses during the war. The war brought on political changes. There's a question on the worksheet about the war deciding which level of government had the most authority, and that was the federal government. The federal government, of course, won out in this war. State government power lessened as a result of the war. Federal government power increased as a result of the war. And war really decreased Southern power in Congress for a long, long time. You have to understand that the United States did not elect a president from a Southern state until 1964 with the election of Lyndon Johnson from Texas. And we did not elect a president of the United States from the Deep South with the election of Jimmy Carter in 1976. It took a long time for the South to recover economically and politically as a result of the Civil War. Probably 100 years at least. All right, moving on. What were the Union strategies for victory? First of all, they wanted to blockade all Southern ports. And I will say that by 1862, the second year of the war, the North had accomplished that. The Southerners had no navy at all. And the North was easily able to blockade Southern ports. They did not allow anything to come in or go out of the South. And you know, 3/4 of the textile mills in Great Britain were relying on Southern cotton. So the war really affected the economy of Great Britain to quite a certain extent. Another goal of the Union was to seize total control of the Mississippi River. In fact, the North seized control of the port of New Orleans as early as April of 1862. And that was a major blow to the South. Finally, in July of 1863, with the North capturing the southern town of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is right on the Mississippi River, the North had total control of the Mississippi River, thus cutting off Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the South. And then, of course, the thing that the North wanted to do was to capture the capital of the South, which was Richmond, Virginia. Amazing that the capital of the North, Washington, D.C., is only about 100 miles from the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, about the same distance between Prescott and Phoenix. And it took the North almost 4 full complete years to capture Richmond, Virginia. It took the North a long time, and mainly because of the expert generalship of a lot of the generals in the Southern Army. So what were the Confederate strategies for victory? Stay home and fight a defensive war. It was the North that had to try to bring the Southern states back into the Union. And so the Confederacy, all they had to do was stay home and protect their own territory. There was also some talk in the middle of the war that maybe France and Great Britain would help support the Southern cause and get involved. Boy, the Confederacy they did everything they could to try to get France and Great Britain's help. But Great Britain had outlawed slavery in 1831, 30 years before the Civil War, American Civil War started. And there was probably very little chance that either France or Great Britain would help a country who still had slavery when they themselves had already outlawed it. And keep the war going as long as they could, hoping that the North would grow tired of the war and public sentiment in the North would basically demand that the Northern government come up with a peace settlement. So moving on here, and this map just illustrates what I just talked about. You can see all these ships out here illustrating the naval blockade, capturing Richmond, Virginia, capturing as much territory in the west out in the Mississippi River Valley, and then of course controlling the Mississippi River. Those were the main goals of the North during the war. Here are the two most famous generals on each side. You had General Ulysses S. Grant, who became the overall commanding general of the North at the end of 1863, and then Robert E. Lee from Virginia. Pretty much the entire war was the #1 commanding general of the South. So we want to talk about some real quick major events during each year of the war. The war actually started in South Carolina with the bombing of Fort Sumter, in which Union troops are still occupying. Fort Sumter is on a small island out in the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina. And on the morning at actually 4:30 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, 1861, the Confederates opened fire on the fort. Actually did not kill anybody. The only thing that was killed was a horse. About a day and a half later, the troops inside Fort Sumter surrendered, and they were allowed to board a ship and leave the area. So that was a bloodless opening to the bloodiest war in American history. The first major battle occurred only about 25 miles west and a little bit south of Washington, D.C., a place called Manassas, Virginia. The Southerners called this battle the Battle of Manassas. The Northerners called it the Battle of Bull Run because there's a creek that runs through Manassas called Bull Run. That was the first major battle of the war, and it ended in a Confederate victory. Let's go to 1862. Ulysses S. Grant was put in charge of troops in the West out in the Mississippi River Valley for the first couple years of the war, and he was real successful. He drove the Confederates out of Kentucky, would eventually drive them out of Tennessee as well. And then, of course, it was in 1862, in spring of 1862, in which we had two ironclad ships called the Merrimac for the South and the Monitor of the North. And they basically just shot at each other. The bombs bounced off each other's ship. No side really won that, but it's significant because it is the first battle, not only in American history, but in world history, in which two ironclad ships battled each other. And then Grant would move on as I just said, to southern Tennessee, win the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th and 7th. Shiloh, Tennessee is about where the states of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi all come together, right on the Tennessee River. In late April, Union forces, as I said earlier, would capture New Orleans. The war was not going well for the North in the first couple years in the East. In Virginia, Robert E. Lee was continually winning victory after victory after victory. He might be considered one of the best generals in all of American history. And then in September, the South decided to try to take the war to the North and win a big victory on Northern soil. And they got as far as Antietam, Maryland, just outside. Antietam's actually the name of a creek, not the name of a town. Antietam Creek. I'm actually wearing today, I'm actually wearing an Antietam shirt, as you can see there. I toured that battlefield with my stepdaughter and wife summer before last. And basically, the battle was really a standoff, but it occurred. It was a one-day battle on September 17th, 1862. And to this date, more Americans lost their lives in a one-day battle at the Battle of Antietam than in any battle in American history. There were over 30,000 casualties in one day at Antietam. And this next is a picture of me standing right at Antietam Creek. That's called the Burnside Bridge there, named after the Union General, General Burnside. And there was a fierce battle across that bridge. If you can see in the background, this tree that's next to the bridge there, they say that that tree is more than 150 years old, and they've done some tree dating on that tree, and probably that tree witnessed the battle. And then the Union lost a very, very critical battle at Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I just toured that battlefield as well about a year and a half ago. Fredericksburg, Virginia, only about 50, 60 miles from Washington, D.C., down in northern Virginia. And the Confederates won that battle, and it was a major defeat. Right after that battle, there were a lot of cries in the North for the North to come up with a peace settlement with the South and end the war. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, there's the number one reason that Lincoln stated that the North was fighting the war was to preserve the Union. He did not want to come out at the beginning of the war and say that the war was for the purpose of ending slavery. And the reason he didn't say that was because he was afraid that that would really cause a number of people in the North, men, to not volunteer for the military. And so right away, he only stated that the one purpose of the war was to preserve the Union, to bring the Southern states back in the Union. But with the proclamation of that he issued in January of 1863, he added a second purpose, and the second purpose was to end slavery. Another reason that he issued this proclamation is he also knew that there were some European countries thinking about joining the South during the war. And by him freeing the slaves in the Southern states, he knew that would have an impact on causing countries like France and Great Britain not to join the South. So one of the most important proclamations in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation, in which, did it actually free all the slaves in the South? No. it was just a statement. I mean, actually, the slaves in the South were not freed until Northern troops came in and freed those areas. So again, we're getting back to just a reminder here, bring this map back up of what parts of the country were in the north and what parts of the country were in the south. Also, the Union kept suffering defeats in Virginia. There was a very, very good general by the name of Thomas Jackson, who got a nickname by the name of Stonewall, who mistakenly got shot by friendly fire in the spring of 1863. And Robert E. Lee said losing General Jackson was like losing his left arm. And so Jackson would pass away. So maybe some of you might want to do some research on Stonewall Jackson, a very interesting general, very good general. And but Lee would lose his top general. Then Lee decided, as we said earlier, in 1862, he wanted to take the war to the north, and he wanted to take the war again to the north after he wasn't able to succeed in Maryland in 1862. He decided to take the war to the north again, and he made it all the way up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is in south central Pennsylvania. It was a 3-day battle, and it is a battle where the most casualties of any battle in American history occurred. But this was over a course of 3 days versus like down at Antietam, that was just a 1-day battle. And the North won this, and most historians will say this is when the North began to win the war, and this is when the South began to lose the war. And on the second day of the battle, on July 2nd, 1863, there was a battle up here on this hill called Little Round Top. And here is my wife and myself on Little Round Top a number of summers ago. We're standing next to a statue. It's the Colonel Warren statue, and the reason there's a statue of Colonel Warren, who was a Union colonel, was he told the Union generals that you better get some cannon up on this hill, otherwise we might lose this battle if we allow the Southerners to get up here and put cannon on the hill. And they heeded Colonel Warren's advice, and the North won the battle up on that hill that day. Okay, so we have, you can see we've already talked about Antietam here. We've talked about Gettysburg here. Here's where Bull Run, there were actually 2 battles of Bull Run, one in July of 1861, another one in August of 1862. And then you can see exactly where Richmond, Virginia is. Of course, Richmond, the capital of the South. So just to give you some bearings as to where some of the locations I've talked about are. And then amazingly, at about the same time the Battle of Gettysburg was going on, the Battle of Vicksburg went on, and Vicksburg on the Mississippi River fell to the Union on July 4th, of all dates, July 4th, 1863. How mad were the residents of Vicksburg, Mississippi, on having to surrender to the North? Vicksburg, Mississippi would not celebrate the 4th of July until World War II. They would not celebrate the 4th of July for 80 years. That's how they felt about the Union taking their town. And then, of course, in the fall of 1863, Lincoln would travel to Gettysburg and give the Gettysburg Address. And in many historians' minds, it is the most famous speech in American history. It was only about a 2.5-minute speech, and we can talk more about that later in class about the Gettysburg Address. Grant later on that year would take Chattanooga, Tennessee, a major railroad center down in the South, which would create a base of operations for the North to take Atlanta. So here was Ulysses S. Grant was put in command of all Union forces at the end of 1863. In fact, he was the general at the Battle of Chattanooga, and the plan was to take Atlanta, and then Atlanta was commanded by a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, and then Sherman went all the way to the coast, exercising total war, and again splitting the South again. And really, with the capture of Atlanta, the writing was on the wall for the South. The South was not going to win this war, had no chance of winning it. Grant assumes command of all Union forces, as I just said. Also, there was another Union general by the name of William Sheridan. Let me go back to this map. He was able to control the entire Shenandoah Valley, which is over here in the western part of Virginia. He was able to take control of that area as well. And then I just talked about William Tecumseh Sherman. And in November of 1864, Lincoln was reelected. He defeated a former Union general that Lincoln had fired. And in fact, he fired him twice. George McClellan was the Democratic nominee in 1864. And Lincoln again got the nomination on the Republican side. And Lincoln defeated him for the presidency for a second term in 1864. And so I already talked about William Tecumseh Sherman waging total war. Grant would keep pressing on towards Richmond, and then he just kept attacking. Even if he lost a battle, he would just keep on attacking. And eventually, finally, on April 2nd, 1865, General Grant and Union forces would take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Now, there is a place over here. Once they took Richmond, Lee was pursued by Grant going into western part of Virginia. And Grant was able to surround Lee's army at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And on April 9th, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant. And that, for all intents and purposes, that ended the war. There were a few skirmishes after April 9th, but no major battles, and that ended the Civil War. So the Civil War started at Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. The surrender ceremony at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, occurred on April 9th, almost exactly 4 years. And then, unfortunately, the next Friday, which was Good Friday, the Lincolns decided to attend a play called Our American Cousin in Washington, D.C. at a theater called Ford's Theater. And that is when the assassin, a very famous actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth, the Booth family were very famous acting. He had an older brother by the name of Edward Booth, who probably was a little bit more of a famous actor than John Wilkes was. And John Wilkes Booth went into a presidential box at Ford's Theater and shot Lincoln. Here's a picture taken of Ford's Theater not long after the assassination, what Ford's Theater looked like. Here is the presidential box. The president was sitting about right in this area. And basically, there's a door. This is the second balcony in the theater. And Booth, in those days, the security of the president wasn't what it is today. And Booth went in there and was able to sneak in during laughter of a certain part of the play of Our American Cousin and shoot the president. And here's a picture of John Wilkes Booth. So we will certainly talk more about the assassination of Lincoln, the very first president to be assassinated. We've had 4 presidents assassinated in American history, Lincoln being the first. So anyway, that pretty much completes all of the answers to the questions on the Civil War Notes worksheet. And the last question is, I'm going to have you do a research project on a topic of the Civil War next week in class. And I want you to start thinking about maybe a topic, maybe a battle, maybe weaponry, maybe a certain person that you want to do research on. There's a lot of interesting topics connected with the Civil War you could do research on. And so that's the last question on the worksheet. It says, next week you will be asked to pick a topic connecting with the Civil War. What topic about the Civil War are you most interested in and doing research on? So I hope you have enjoyed this overall presentation on the Civil War. It is, I have a hard time deciding what is my most favorite topic in American history, and it's between the Civil War and the American Revolution. So I hope you're able to watch this well. And again, thanks for your attentiveness, and we'll talk more about the Civil War later. Have a good one.